So what we've got then is how to create that flexible stocking plan, and you'll see in this slide presentation that we've got some slides that address those. I want to spend most of the time based on those trigger dates and monitoring that forage production, and then at the end of these slides there's actually a example of how we use the trigger dates to make decisions last year here in Ellsworth County. So for those of you after the presentation, you're more than welcome to go back through that archive and look at these presentations, because I understand that those are going to be made available to you. All right, so we're going to jump down here then through a couple of these that Jerry talked about last time. You guys have seen all of this. The A, B, and C herd, things to remember. And I guess I'll just stop in here to make sure that the point about the flexible stocking plan is to have a plan in place. I don't think that a plan in your head is a very good place to start. When things go south, you have to make decisions, and most of those decisions need to be made not knee-jerk reactions at the loading chute, but actually have a plan in place and understand which direction that you're going to go with those cows, steers, or whatever that happens to be. So then you've got the problem, if you decide to destock at some point based on these trigger dates, to go ahead and divide that remaining herd into 3 herds again. And it was painful the first time. It'll be painful the second time. We understand that. But it's one of those things that needs to be done again because of the upcoming decisions for the rest or the remainder of the year. Okay. Trigger dates are simply tools. They're supposed to be used to help managers adapt to that variation in rainfall season by season, certainly year to year, and the forage production. We understand and know that rainfall, precipitation, or effective moisture, the moisture that we get, the rainfall that we get through the soil surface becomes effective rainfall. And that drives the bigger part of the forage production system. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly the biggest thing that drives the system. So timely events, but also amounts make a huge difference. So these trigger dates are simply designed to be tools. We'll go through, hopefully, the way that we develop those, and everybody can see the way that we developed these several years ago. And they've been tried and tested several times. We're testing the limits of those. I think, Ted, you would agree that we haven't needed to use those, fortunately, up until now for a drought that's lasted longer than about 2 years. Okay, here's what we used to develop those trigger dates. As a producer for your area, then, you're going to need to know your historic monthly average precip. You can get that off the website there at the National Weather Service. You need to know your general forage phenology curve. When does the grass grow and how much of it grows? I'll give you an example of that so you can see how that works in just a second. Most of the time, the Extension Service or the Natural Resource Conservation Service can help you develop that for the different types of forages that you might have on the different elevations or the different places in the pasture, from the meadows to the uplands, where those forages those phenology curves may be a bit different. And then you need to know the ranch's average sustainable carrying capacity. And by that I mean these trigger dates only work if you're properly stocked. And the only way to be properly stocked is to have a plan or a grazing plan and understand what that sustainable carrying capacity actually is. So if you've got that, or those 3 items, then you can develop that flexible stocking plan, and these trigger dates should be pretty valuable. Here's an example then of that precipitation production relationship for central Kansas. Ted had several years of good records to drive this thing and started discussing it one day, and we got sat down and looked at the precip curve. When does the precipitation happen? And what does that mean to the production curve? Let me see if I can make this arrow go. What we noticed was that certainly the March and April and then the May precipitation drives then the April, May, and June production. What we wind up with in June is a function of not only precip, but like Jerry said in the last presentation, it's also a function of heat and wind and transpiration rates and all those different things that affect production. But you've got to get the precip in June before you can start to see the production in July. What happens after July out here starts to occur, even though if we get the precip, you can see that the production curve really doesn't respond favorably to the precipitation. So what we mean by that, or what I'm trying to explain here, is that this precip is important for next year's growth. Okay, so the way that these grasses finish the season start to put energy back into those root crowns and start getting those plants prepared to come out of this area next year, so that this steep line, this production line right here, can respond well or favorably to what precip that we do get. If we don't finish the season well out here, this line, it may be steep, but it's going to peak somewhere in here as opposed to up here. All right. These are the trigger dates that we developed for Kansas. I would say that for the most part, these are in thirds. So the eastern third of Kansas, the central third of Kansas, and the western third. You can see that the eastern third is not so heavily dependent upon the previous 12 months or the previous 24-month period. The reason for that is that this area basically gets anywhere from 24 to 36 inches of rain, and the recharge is very rapid and very extensive. When they're getting rain, it's not a big deal. The central part, however, doesn't get that amount of rainfall. The precipitation isn't there. So the previous 12 months starts to play a bigger factor, and certainly this September, November of the way that we finished up last year starts to play a bigger factor in the total production for the year that we can expect. In the West, we're looking at all the way back to 24 months. That's a pretty big part of the way that these trigger dates work. You can also see that April 1 is about the same, June the 15th for here. We're a little bit earlier out in the western side. July the 15th is the same, a little earlier out in the western side. August 15th, a little earlier again out in that western side. Our elevation goes up a little bit as we go to the west, and the effects of that later precip are not as heavy as they would be in June and July for the central and eastern part of the area. All right. So for the central region, that's the one I'm going to use as an example. And what we then do is look at these previous 12 months and ask these questions. How did the pasture finish the growing season? Was it short, normal, below normal, above normal? Did it finish strong? Jerry talked about this a little bit last time. And the bigger question, especially during these droughts, is did you leave enough standing residue and mulch at the end of the winter dormancy? Okay, so coming out of March maybe into April, is there enough grass there, mulch, standing or on the soil surface to protect the soil? So if we do start getting those rains in April, May, and June, can it get through the soil surface? Is something protecting the soil surface to help that become effective precipitation instead of just rain? We don't want to see any more water run off there than we have to. Also, we're looking in then the next area that we start to look at is that September, November, the latter part of the growing season. How did that pasture finish? How did those grasses finish out the season? If the grasses were short, and they were here last year, there's going to be little crown energy stored. So those plants are going to come out this spring with less energy. I would expect them to not be as vigorous. In fact, we got a little bit of rain. We were really dry up in the north central part of the state last year during June, July, and August. We got a little bit of rain somewhere around the middle of August, and everything greened up a little bit. It grew 3 or 4 inches. The problem was that the cows were still in those pastures, and those cows slicked that new green grass up very rapidly. Those plants were trying to get some solar collectors, some leaves up there, to help them go into the fall in better shape than what they had just survived that portion of the drought last summer. With the cows eating that amount of leaf area, it even depleted the energy stored in that crown even further. So the pastures that had a chance to rest last year should be in better shape if they got that chance to recover a little bit from that late season growth, at least until frost or dormancy. The ones that still had cows in them, I would expect them to be even more depleted coming out of this spring. All right. For the central region, then we're looking right now at this November 1 to April 1. We're looking at trying to maintain at least that 800 pounds of residue. And the first year, I'm trying to look at the standing residue or mulch of my more desirable species, certainly. Once we get into these droughts, these longer-term droughts, I'm thinking right now, and we're into our second and third and maybe fourth year in the southwest part of the state, that any residue on that soil surface is good, whether it's cool season or annuals or perennials, whatever that it happens to be out there. Ted, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, it's very important as we get into, I'm right now experiencing into 34 months of this, to maintain some kind of residual litter on the ground. It's, you know, when you get these days that are 70 degrees followed by, 20-degree days, it's very important. It's hard to do, but that's how I've been looking at it. Go ahead, Dwayne.
Okay. Once that November through April 1 decision is made, as we approach this April 1st area, we're going to try to figure out what our initial stocking rates are. The way that we approach it, at least from a one or a short-term drought, has been this less than 4 inches of effective moisture since November 1. So if we finish the season in fairly good shape, above average or average, but we've had a dry winter, as Brian indicated, we don't have a lot of moisture in the soil profile. They've got long-term plans or forecasts for a drought. We may reduce that initial stocking rate by at least 10% by weight, not by number, but certainly by weight. This year, we're looking at a drought. We're in our second year of drought. We didn't get any, we went into the fall short last year. We haven't had that 4 inches of effective moisture. We're reducing our initial stocking rates anywhere from 20 to 25% by weight this spring, just trying to keep up in anticipation of what's going to happen through that April, May, June time frame. The next trigger date then is June the 15th. In an average year, about 75% of that average precipitation has occurred. Only about 50% of the forage production, though, has been grown. And so we've got about a 30 to 45-day lag between the precip that occurs and the production, the forage production, above-ground biomass that's grown. So in this case, if our precip for November through that June 15th is less than 80%, then we're going to plan to reduce the stocking rate by 30% by weight for the remainder of the season. And I put this little note at the bottom. Last year, our green up was about 3 to 4 weeks earlier than normal, which meant that our calendar, our trigger dates, should have moved up about 3 to 4 weeks, certainly 2 weeks if you went by our wheat harvest here was 2 to 3 weeks earlier. So instead of June the 15th, what I'm saying is that we should have been looking at this the last day of May, or the last week of May, or the first week of June to make this same trigger date effective. This is probably the bigger one for the state of Kansas, maybe into Oklahoma and Nebraska. This July the 15th date. If you look down here at the second bullet, it says that about 75% of the grass production has occurred. That happens nearly every time. Again, last year, because of our green up dates, how warm we were early in the season, this trigger date probably occurred closer to July the 1st, maybe the last week of June, because of that early green up. The point of it is this third bullet, and I've seen this happen more than once, even if it starts raining tomorrow, that growth, we will not get a catch-up growth in forage. Those plants, they'll grow, but they cannot produce, they can't catch up in forage production. What they want to try to do then is get into the reproductive stage about as quickly as possible, and you'll see biomass produced, and I've weighed a bunch of seed stems and seed heads out there, and so when you just measure the total biomass, sometimes it works itself out where you're not showing much of a loss in total biomass production. But when we talk about forage production, things are way different. So by July the 15th here in Kansas, we need to be making some serious decisions. The other thing is not only precipitation that we're going to want to do, but we want to measure that available forage to see how much is left in the pastures. How is the recharge or the regrowth coming back behind those cows if you're in a rotation or you've moved cows out of pastures? What does that look like, and how much is in front of those cows? Because if we're behind on precipitation again, what you're doing is measuring, although you're measuring forage, you're actually measuring time. How much time do you have for that set of cows in the pasture or on the ranch? Then we get into this August 15th. This is a really good time to start figuring out how much grass is in front of those cows for the winter. We've got 90% of that forage grown by then. We're still looking at trying to keep some sort of minimum residue out there on the ground for next spring and the soil surface protection as much as possible. And even though we've been in these droughts now 2, 3, maybe 4 years, we've got to start thinking about how these plants or pastures are going to recover, how fast they're going to recover, and how fast you're going to get back in the ball game as a rancher. I don't know that we talk a lot about the drought and maintaining the cow herd, and I think that that's very vital, but I also think that we need to understand how the ecology of these systems work and how much time it's going to take, depending on the decisions that we make this year, how long that's going to take to recover once it does start raining. So the whole point of this is that we want a more favorable weather forecast. Brian, in the future, we'd certainly like to have one of those, but that next year's forage production depends on the rainfall and the decisions of management that we make this year. You can get these historic monthly precipitation patterns and these forage phenology curves from the people in your area, the National Drought Mitigation Center or the weather forecasting sites and conservation office or extension offices in your counties, and put these curves together and see what the responses are between the precip and the forage production curve. Then we'll transition here from the trigger dates into the monitoring. They're very similar to the monitoring or the precipitation dates. We just need to figure out when or how much information that you want to know. We use this July the 15th or September the 1st dates very heavily as a minimum for this monitoring. We use a Robel pole here. I think that it's important to understand that it's simply a yardstick. Dr. Robel designed this several years ago, And what it does is measure forage height in inches, and then it converts that to pounds. During the growing season, however, that you need to remember that in tall drop seed and silver blue stem and over blue stem are grasses that we would consider to be invaders here. I'm sure that you've got others in your area that you could identify. During the growing season, the cows do not think of those as forage. So when you're using this Robel pole to measure the average forage height in the inches out there, use the ones that the cows are eating at the time that you're doing the measurements. These grasses may be very good in the dormant season or may be used. I wouldn't necessarily go with good. That may be a misnomer. But they could be used in the dormant season with enough supplemental protein that the cows could get by on them, but they're not, during the growing season, the cows don't look at those as forage. So there's not any reason to be measuring those. Here's a quick run-through of how we use that Robel pole. The conservation, range conservationist or the conservation office can help you with the frames, or the extension office to get a frame for your area. But basically what we do is use a frame and randomly select areas out there, use the Robel pole to measure the inches, use the frame then and clip inside those frames to get a weight. So we collect the biomass, dry that out if you want to, and figure then out what the total forage or biomass is out there for that pasture or that area. And then your total forage minus whatever residual that you need to leave in the pasture for the plants equals your available forage. That available forage divided by the herd demand equals time. And that's essentially what you're doing, is figuring out how many bites or bales of hay are in the pasture by using this Robel pole, okay? So it's one of those things where we turn inches, which we can measure very quickly, into weight in total forage throughout the pasture. I can take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of measurements using that Robel pole very quickly. This clipping and weighing takes a lot of time, but that'll give me a pretty good idea of how much available forage is in each pasture. And then I know how much time or herd time that I've got per pasture on the ranch. Okay.